Welcome to the Art for Human Rights podcast. My name is Alex Searle, and together with me on this podcast, we'll be diving into the minds of some of the world's most accomplished and creative artists, musicians, poets, activists, change makers, as they share their stories and experiences with us about how art is continually making a positive impact on the world and also in the struggle for human rights. There are over 26 million refugees scattered across the world right now, across different war fronts and different terrible situations they find themselves every day. So it's our sincere belief, not only on this podcast, but our organization, Arts for Human Rights as well, that showcasing the role of art, creating, expressing, talking about it, sharing it, not only is an invaluable source of expression, but also a source of hope for all of us, every single one of us on this planet. Today, our first episode, very first inaugural podcast episode, we speak with Milan-born architect and visionary Matteo Pericoli, who speaks to us about the art of seeing. Enjoy the episode. Here it comes. So Matteo, welcome to the podcast, the very first episode of the Art for Human Rights podcast. It's a very big pleasure and an honor to have you with us.
Thank you, Alex. It's a huge pleasure for me, an honor. Thanks.
Yeah, wonderful. I'm looking forward to our conversation today. So just for context for our listeners, Matteo, you are a Milan-born architect. You're an illustrator, a writer, a teacher, a traveler, and I hear quite the espresso drinker as well. But who can blame you? You've also authored several books, including Manhattan Unfurled, The City Out of My Window, 63 Views on New York, Windows on the World, 50 Writers, 50 Views, and recently The Great Living Museum of Imagination, a guide to the exploration of literary architecture. His drawings have appeared in publications such as the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Observer, the Paris Review Daily, and La Stampa in Italy. And in 2007, the mural skyline of the world that you created was installed at the new American Airlines terminal at JFK International Airport. And in 2010, you founded the Laboratory of Literary Architecture, a cross-disciplinary exploration of literature as architecture. That's fascinating, and I look forward to unpacking that a little bit more as well with you. But I'd love to just start with some of your context, your background. Tell me a little bit about your early life and how you ended up ultimately falling in love with the US or rather New York City, because you created all of these incredible drawings of the skyline and certain sort of vantage points of the city at different places. I'd love to hear about what led you to that.
Well, yeah, you pack many things into presentation. It's very flattering, and looking back, I would say that the studying architecture has been an essential part of all of this. Perhaps I studied architecture in Italy. I was born in Milan, as you said, and I studied architecture there, I don't know. I grew up and studied architecture while being told that the past and cities look in a certain way, and because Italy is so filled of amazing things, it made sense that the past made more sense than anything else, and history of architecture was the most important thing, and that was all fine until I realized that it wasn't fine, basically, that it wasn't enough, that it wasn't inspiring as it might be for many people, maybe for people who come from another background. And so at the end of my architectural studies in Milan, I felt a desire of living for a little bit in a place that seemed to come without that package, that seemed to come without all of those strings attached to a past, that maybe inspired it, but also restrained it. And so I moved to New York, thinking that New York was far away, not only distance-wise, but in terms of tradition, in terms of ways of seeing the present, what architecture is. Because architecture, we all know it, but we never talk about it. I mean, architecture is life, how we live, where we are born, where we experience all of our incredible moments in our lives. They are always kind of framed by spaces, by architecture, by opening a window, the symbolism of going through a threshold. I mean, it's clear you go through a threshold and something changes. You go down the stairs or up the stairs. We even use verbally architecture as a way to describe our life. And so I got there and realized that obviously all of the things that had been not really told, but all of the things that I had absorbed over the 20 plus years that I'd been living in Europe, in Milan, were wrong about New York City, that it felt completely different. And I had not had a wonderful experience growing up in Milan in the 70s and 80s. I thought that cities were born from a completely pragmatic, with this solely pragmatic idea of keeping things assembled because it's easier. But there was in Milan, I never felt that there was any true spirit hidden in the place, any soul. I felt always detached from it, wanting to go away all the time to Central Italy, where my family's from. And so cities are just cities, many people living together is easier than many people living far away from each other. But then I got to New York and I felt like I was in Central Italy. I felt like I was in a series of, dozens of small villages living with the same spirit. And I fell in love, like really fell in love.
Perhaps it was also the kind of the contrast, as human beings, we always look for contrasts and extremes, something like Italy and, some of the areas that you said your parents and perhaps, your grandparents were from. Those are kind of steeped in, European history where you kind of had a very specific way of doing things, how families grew up, how people lived their lives. And then you go to a place like New York, which is on the other side, which is this massive concrete jungle. It's so impressive and huge in every single way. So it was bound to excite your imagination in some kind of way, which is what led you to create these incredible, create these sort of, massive drawings, these hyper kind of detailed, realistic, beautiful drawings on Manhattan and some of the other boroughs. Do you want to talk a bit about that? Like how that came into your head? Why did you want to draw New York?
I wanted to embrace it. I wanted to hug it. I wanted to embrace it literally and hug it as physically because I didn't understand why I was so infatuated with a place made of things, thinking that cities were just an assemble of things, and that didn't make sense. But the thing is that I was expecting all of the things you said about New York, but I got the opposite. I got a place that was very warm and welcoming. The place that wanted me to be there, wanted me to tell the place, so what do you think of me? I had never encountered a city that was not finished, that was still in the process of being resolved, that wanted to know what people coming from elsewhere thought of itself. In Europe, it's not like this. You must study a long time if you want to enter into the mechanism, an urban or fabric mechanism of a city. You must know why it's there, if it's the Romans or before or after, but still the past is like this layer you have to go through before understanding. New York, it's instantaneous because of the fabric of the city, because of the I don't know, the warmth. It's what I felt, not this jungle and size. Why is it so real and alive? And why does it seem to love me, which it didn't clearly, but why then I do so to the place? And so I traveled everywhere. I took bikes and started to draw little parts of the city. And then one day I had this revelation by taking the Circle Line, a very hyper touristic attraction, which is basically a boat that goes all around the island of Manhattan. And there I saw the whole thing. I could embrace it. I could hug it with my hands. I could see the beginning and the end. And so the idea, which is inherent in architecture, which is a drawing, has to be clear, has to represent in a narrative way something absolutely pristine, because somebody has to build it, perhaps, if it's a project. I mean, somebody has to understand. There's no artistic impetus that you put in an architectural drawing. It's just, are you clear in what you're saying? because somebody then has to do it or whatever. So I try to apply the same principle in making sense of this gigantic mass, because it is big, as you were saying, but that at the same time was not only extremely tall, but it was extremely long. And so 1 year of work at night produced a 37-foot long single drawing of the entire profile of the city. And I was surprised by what happened, because it was not done before, strangely for me, because it was all there. And so I realized that line drawing, architecturally inspired line drawing, can work to tell something about a place by constantly lying in terms of perspectives, because you can't do a single perspective because everything looks wrong. And you can put all of yourself in transferring what you feel and what you see in a clear, as you said, hyper detailed, which is not hyper detailed, because I thought of a drawing that could be that could be colored by kids, that could be interacted with and understand, what is a skyline, etc., etc. And so these things just happened to me.
Wow, amazing. So there was this massive kind of paper mural that you'd put together, 37 feet, which is, the size of a middle range sailboat. I mean, this is a really big thing, right? This is unwieldy, to say the least. It's an enormous piece of art, and that was essentially picked up by the New Yorker, right? Or at least something kind of picked up the curiosity of other people around what you were doing about the city, drawing everyone's favorite city, and they wanted to celebrate it, right?
Yeah, I wrote to many people when it was done, because I realized that there wasn't a drawing that represented the entirety of the island. And I wrote to several people in magazines and newspapers saying, look, this happened to me. I drew this one big piece of paper that has the entirety of the island of Manhattan. And Paul Goldberger of the New Yorker critic at the time, wrote me back and said, why don't you come and show me? So I went to the New Yorker offices and I enrolled for the first time, because my house was a little bit bigger than this studio closet where I'm in now. And so I could never see the entirety of what I had done, because I never measured anything. I never measured the height, the proportions. So it was all done as an attempt to render the relationship with the place. And I enrolled the 37 feet in the corridor at the New Yorker, and everybody came out like at a market looking at this drawing, recognizing the city, which seemed surprising to me because I had drawn it so they could recognize it. And the energy was incredible. And so that led to a book contract with Random House. And so I left the career of the architect, I don't know, forever, or who knows, yes, until now. And I did the other side, and that came out after a year and a half or so as an accordion book in 2001.
Yeah, incredible. And so that also kind of started this journey around, this big sort of factor of perspective in your drawing, right? It's sort of somebody is doing the seeing. Someone is kind of watching the perspective that they have on what is a public place like New York, a city, or whatever it is. So and it's also kind of this window view, everyone's kind of unique perspective. It's pretty profound, and it's also the kind of thing that you put into use when putting together the Windows on Elsewhere piece as well, which is an incredible piece of work, which we'll talk about in a moment as well, because that also features the stories of refugees from all over the world, and they alongside your drawing, which is obviously influenced by their story, there's the kind of a unique view that they had either from a childhood bedroom window, or perhaps a window from across the street, or maybe overlooking a park or something like that. And that was something that you could draw. But so tell me a bit about kind of the act of seeing. How do you sort of see it, if you like? You can.
How do we see seeing?
Yeah, exactly. Because this is it's profound, and it's also what led us to kind of create, as in support of Amnesty International, Art for Human Rights. We put this together with you. So the Windows on Elsewhere. Yeah, how do you sort of see seeing, and where does the kind of the inspiration come from when it comes to drawing that perspective in that hyper realistic, beautiful detail?
You kindly insist on the hyper detailed, but I think Yes, even at the time, I mean, we're talking about 20 years ago, and I was very interested. I mean, I was not aware that I was very interested in the fact that we don't just see things. I mean, seeing I was coming from a wrong perception of seeing or reading,
Mm.
for that matter, as a passive acts, that something is plus and something is minus. In the interaction there is a plus and there is a minus, and the minus is the recipient. One gives and the other one takes. And I think it is I don't know exactly why I had this idea. Maybe I was just wrong, or maybe culturally we do divide those who produce from those who receive somewhat, in creativity, for example, in anything. And instead, well, even by doing this very long drawing, I was interested in the fact that to be able to render something that is definitely there, you have to actively make mistakes and transform
Right.
the act of viewing, because otherwise people wouldn't understand it. If I were to follow very precise guidelines, such as a frontal view, heights, or what the photographs, the hundreds of photographs that I've taken, I would have to make render things that were not even very realistic. So I needed to modify many aspects of what I was seeing in order to render it. And so I realized that I was looking for the place that I was infatuated with, but at the same time, I was looking for how do I perceive the place that I'm so infatuated with, and how do people see it? And then the revelation that you were referring to indirectly for the project that I did with you for Amnesty and Amnesty International Art for Human Rights, is that I was moving out of the apartment where I was living, and I realized that I needed to take with me the window itself. The physical window frame had to come with me, with the entire city attached behind, because that view had framed my idea of the place for 7 years. Had I left it behind, I would have left a part of me. I could have brought the bed, the desk, the pens, the books, but leaving the window view behind would have meant abandoning an interlocking thing that made my being connected with the city. So I got scared. I couldn't take it
Mm.
with me because they wouldn't let me. Had I also been able to take the frame, the city behind would not have come with me. I took pictures,
Yeah.
and the pictures didn't work because they would show the urban landscape or the urbanscape, but didn't show the view. The photograph of the window itself would have shown a frame. And so I drew it very large on a piece of wrapping paper, just to simulate the fact that I was peeling off the view from the window. And there started a universe of discovery, that's what I wanted to see of New York. I didn't want to just draw everything from the outside, from Central Park and other places and whatever. I wanted to enter the minds of all of the inhabitants and see what they see, because that's the really invisible city. I mean, we are celebrating Calvino's 100th the anniversary of his birth, and this invisible city somehow maybe keep coming back. But that would be an otherwise invisible city. Unless you enter the minds of people, you do not understand how a city is perceived. So that led to a project about New York in 2009, and then on and on and on, writers, until I met I met Art for Human Rights, and realized that the act of seeing is loaded, is enriched, is empowered. I don't know which of these words works best, but by all of that we are, all of that we know, all of our memories, what we have left behind, all of the machinery, time-wise and space-wise, that allows us to be there in front of this frame, looking out at a world that is not touchable because you can only touch the frame. And so the window as an architectural element is the most powerful in terms of symbolism, metaphor, and almost physics or metaphysics, because it's both real and unreal. You can't touch. You can touch paintings, you can touch, the drawing of a view, but you cannot touch the view. That is elsewhere, even for yourself. And so that's how the project began. What do people who have left their homes, their lands, their families, their past, and they cannot go back? What do they see? They don't see what we see. They cannot be seeing what we see. So that's what what I feel or think about the act of seeing.
I love hearing you talk. It's really so profound because it makes so much sense. You know, it's the perspective that you have is obviously completely individual. It's an individual experience that only makes sense to you and carries that value. But at the same time, what you see or what you are looking out onto, whether it's a city or a park or wherever you are, is also sort of public and it's it's shared by everyone. So that's where that sense of familiarity comes from. So what I want to do now is just read a quick excerpt from one of the entries of one of the refugees featured in this gorgeous collection of drawings and stories, Windows and Elsewhere, from a refugee called Abir Al-Jundi. And I'm just going to read their story, and I want to, and also if we're watching the video component of this podcast, we'll show some clips of the actual drawing that accompanies this story that you produced. And I'd love to hear afterwards just your perspective on the perspective. I want to hear how you kind of rendered all of that out based on this, because it all makes sense. You know, for example, the New York drawings that you created, that was your perspective, but this was someone else's perspective, which then requires an interpretation on that perspective, which is fascinating, and I'd love to hear what you say. But let me just read this short excerpt quickly. In my apartment in Ljubljana, there is a wide and open view from my window. However, memory casts its shadow on the view, since the buildings in the foreground remind me of the buildings in Damascus. The far mountain, despite its permanent whiteness, reminds me of Mount Qasun, which surrounds the city of Damascus as a bracelet surrounds the wrist of a hand. There is both nostalgia and the cruelty of being a refugee. I have made friends here. I like to leave my apartment and its window view to join my friends in the local falafel restaurant. It reminds me of home. I see the outside world, what's outside that window. I'm in Slovenia now, learning, settling, and enjoying the traditional patika dessert. So it's such a sort of a simple yet unmistakably individual perspective, and the whole kind of piece is loaded with all of these incredible stories, which range from funny to completely heartbreaking and tear-jerking. All of these stories of people who carry these stories with them, and just like they carry their stories, they carry this perspective, they carry this view that they can never, have erased from their minds, of a childhood bedroom window or an apartment view. And so how, maybe just to start off with this excerpt that I read now from Abir's story, how did you go about creating that drawing? What kind of, were there certain words that inspired you? How did you put that together in your mind?
Alex, the truth is that I did none of the things you just said. I mean, the idea was always, and has always been, even previous projects in which there was no mission other than showing what things look like. Now there was something else, and what I always wanted to do, and I always and we did it with Bill Shipsey, the founder of Art for Human Rights, and really ran the project and ran me as a person, was that I wanted to offer the simplest platform for the stories to take another dimension. I didn't want to intervene in any way. In fact, we were very strict and rigorous in order for the stories to come out as naturally as possible. I did the drawings before almost knowing who these people were. I mean, we would select the people. Bill would do this basically with my, support and help. We designed, we drew the map of the world to see where these elsewhere, where they would be coming from. Mm-hmm. But the elsewheres that we chose are the places where these people live now, and they're welcomed, hopefully, or hosted, or have their lives, because we wanted to show that their elsewhere was basically could also be seen as our elsewhere, because we aren't really able to see what the world looks like at our windows, because we are used to it. And so all I did, I called myself, whenever we did the meetings, the chief line executor. I mean, I wanted to do the drawings as well as I could. I would be receiving tens of photographs from them first. I would put all of my expertise or blind experience in making the drawings because they had to show their view of now. And then we would send them the images of the drawings once it was done. So they would have a chance to see their own view via a layer of somebody else's perspective.
Yes.
So we would add the only thing that I would add this is how, given your photographs, the many, many photographs, because there isn't one window view, as you know. It depends on where you are sitting. It depends on the moment of the day. It depends if you're walking towards the window or going away from it. It depends on your mind, your memory of your own window view. And so by offering them a drawing of their views, I think the needed slight distance from the moment was created. And then we would just ask them, this is your view. Tell us what you see based on what has happened to you in your life. Does the past affect what you're seeing, or is what you're seeing now, in this case in Viana, does it affect what you remember? Is there a two-way interaction between a memory that comes from the past, like a wave hitting you from behind, or the strength, the power of your desires connected to the present works backward in modifying your memories? And this was the simple offering that we had the luck of putting together for all of these 60 views that then was so clear and so rigorous that allowed, as you said, for an amazing cross and inter-reading of all of these stories, in which you can go from feeling hopeful for humanity to saying, this is not good, these stories are heartbreaking. And mine is just, I feel humble and honored to have been able to just give them, here is your view, as seen by somebody who just draws them. And the uniformity of the drawings allows for a better, inter-reading. Photographs, you might think, could have worked the same, but photographs are different because, again, they can focus on what is outside more than the framing. And by doing this kind of drawing, maybe hyper detailed, although I try to do as few lines as possible to say the most, I think let them allow all of these amazing people to calmly, perhaps, share incredibly intense perceptions that we do not see looking outside our windows. There are one or two from Turin. He sees Turin, which is where I live now, where I'm now talking to you, in a different way. It is not the same as I see it, or as people who are born and raised here see it, obviously.
Wow. It's so profound. And of course, when you consider the experiences that some of these people have gone through in order to just survive, just to make it out of their country, or to escape a situation, or to go somewhere else where they can make a life for themselves. But they carry that perspective, they carry those stories. Sometimes they even carry memories of their family, whatever it might be. And then for that to be celebrated, or to be remembered, or just to sometimes help them be reminded of certain views, certain perspectives, certain memories that they carry, is super profound. So I want to talk about human rights for a moment, because that's obviously the central kind of core, the foundation of what we do as an organization. We sort of bring that nexus between art and human rights, and sort of unpack, well, what does it mean for art and creativity, whether it's music or art or architecture, the different beautiful forms of art? What does it mean for it to contribute, or to highlight, or to to celebrate human rights where it's gone right, and also where there might be certain areas of improvement, because that's what we do as a human species, right? We get it right, and sometimes we get it wrong, and sometimes when we get it wrong, there are catastrophic consequences. And unfortunately, because there's still a whopping 26 million refugees in the world, still, it's an unbelievable number. There's still this continual fight, to be able to just have the very basics that perhaps you and I don't even think about on a daily basis: the right to vote, the right to make my own decisions, the right to have freedom of political association, the right to say what I want, all of these things are, priceless freedoms that many, many people don't get, or have the misfortune of being taken away from them. So for you, in terms of art and the act of creation, what does it mean to you to be able to kind of highlight what we've talked about, these sorts of stories where people are struggling to just attain those basic human right freedoms, which should be given, or at least should be something that we all enjoy, but we live in a world where it isn't? What do you think art's role is in that? Or perhaps from your perspective, no pun on perspective, what is your role, do you think, that you bring to that fight?
Wow.
I know it's a big question. I'm throwing the big ones at you, Matteo, but it's because I know you can answer them.
No, I can't, and I won't. I can't, and I will, but it's big, and so because it's big, it makes me feel even smaller. And before beginning this project, and before meeting you and Bill, and I had really sincerely never thought that by doing hyper detailed drawing could lead to anywhere except making hyper detailed drawing, and see what that can do to people who want to see hyper detailed drawing, which are not seen as very. This is not. They're not seen as very artistic, because sketches, and there are other forms. Lines are unusual because they really do not exist. You can sketch and recreate patterns, and you create with painting the impression that between two areas of different colors there is a line in between. But lines are an abstraction from reality, and this is the connection with architecture. And so I never thought that putting my mind into these obsessive areas could lead to anywhere. But there has been a kind of a quantum jump or leap into another area, and to realize that by doing the very same thing and offering, as I said before, a small contribution to a debate that clearly wasn't, in many cases, was not met with the right temperature, with the right vision, with the right perspective. Perhaps I felt that if one can offer another viewpoint, because often all you need to not resolve a debate and turn it into a dialogue, all you need perhaps is to move to the side and look at the same situation from a slightly different viewpoint, which is why it is so hard to have people come to terms to things that are so obvious. I think human rights, or these things you mentioned, which are much bigger than me, may be assimilated to air or oxygen. While you breathe, you never think about it. Imagine for a moment that you don't have air to breathe. I think at that moment you get into a panic mode. Yeah. And I think human rights are just like that. There is a moment in which you breathe and oxygen isn't enough in the air. And what do? People don't understand you because they do just, you have a little less or whatever. No, it must be like not having air. And I don't think that when there are debates about this, I don't think that when there are people who clash, I don't believe that either of the sides moves slightly, a few degrees to meet the other. So I think art is a gigantic word, grandly misused, but it's only the fact that if you have one viewpoint, one angle that you can offer, everybody hits 90 degrees perpendicular to each other, and you have the luck of being shifted 20 degrees over, and you say, look, 1 second, I'm here 20 degrees over to the side, and I see the same thing you're talking about from this slightly different viewpoint. And it can be music, it can be a metaphor, it can be anything, it can be a window view. Look what people see of your places from another. Why don't you listen to the stories just by the most simple of all acts, which is stopping in front of a window? And that is a very, to say enriching is a euphemism, humbling, or it's a honor. So I am, and the other thing about so-called art is that if it does work, it works where you project it, perhaps, and that's a dream. I mean, you reach people, but at the same time, if you do reach people, I think physiologically you disappear. It's as if the extension of your being gets longer and then longer
Yes.
and then longer. So you become a part of a network, and you should disappear when you have the lack of. Drawing window views for 15 years. My daughter was born and I was drawing window views. And after 13 or 14, I kept doing window views. And she told me, why don't you stop? Can't you do something else? But at the same time, you maybe reach people or something elsewhere, and you feel this sense of diminishing. And unfortunately, art often produces the other strange effect, which is one feels bigger or more important, and that's something clearly wrong. But because the other effect is that maybe by doing a very simple act for you, which is the hyper detailed drawings, in reality you may be able to reach many more people than you imagined, and then you slowly it's like you get diluted into a larger mass, and it is good. I think it is a very good feeling, and it is you feel, even if I'm in this closet, you feel somehow that maybe you're more connected.
Yes,
and
yes.
that's all you can do. I think I wish I was more active. I wish I was more of a real activist. I wish I had the courage to do other things, and just having had the chance to slightly open this window onto your world, it's an honor.
Yeah,
That's
well,
it.
I love what you've said, and I think that it's really quite profound what you've done and what you continue to do. And I suppose why the connection there between art and creativity and human rights is so compelling, because sometimes just expressing a point of view, or being able to create a viewpoint or create something that can, depending on the times in the day, depending on where you find yourself in history, it can be incredibly thought-provoking to the point where it sparks a conversation that is difficult to have, or to the point where it starts a resistance, or it starts a movement. It starts to change things in society, which should be essential. And in this case, I suppose we're all, agreeing that something like art for human rights should be an essential privilege that every human being has, but unfortunately doesn't. And so until that point is reached, something like art will always be something that can draw attention to that. The act of creation, the act of seeing, is something that allows that resistance to stay active, until those things are realized, until freedom and until human rights is something that, more people rather than not can enjoy, because that perspective and their perspective matters.
What you were saying makes me think of the short introduction by the then the director of Amnesty International Italy, Gianni Ruffini, who unfortunately has passed away since, and he was able, more than I was ever, to summarize or compact the idea of the project, because he says, and I'm quickly translating about the project itself, Windows on Elsewhere, he says, it is important for us who, basically for us who look, who know, and who denounce people who have human rights in mind and in their hearts, not only that the eyes see, but that the eyes see through other people's eyes, eyes that are neither theirs nor ours, but common eyes, a common vision. So what is important is saying is that I thought that it would be nice, as I said about New York, that I see the city through somebody else's eyes, or we are now, Windows on Elsewhere is about seeing our own world through these people's and these stories' eyes. But all he says is that, yes, this is all good, but when are we going to realize that there is only one vision, there is only one way of seeing, which is the way of seeing, which is the one that obviously doesn't even talk about
and our
air,
oneness. Yeah.
or oxygen or human rights, because we all have to breathe.
Yeah.
We all have to breathe, so we all need the things that make breathing.
And the well-being of someone
enormous.
else is my well-being. And so that's that connection. And that's why, once again, just to go even a level deeper of what you're saying, is that it's really about empathy and realizing the inherent connection we all have. You know, if someone else doesn't have the rights that I have, well, then it's just as bad for me as it is for them. It's something that is fundamentally being denied. And art is a way to kind of connect that, or to start that conversation, or to sort of make that kind of connection known. Yeah.
Yes, I would say so. And plus, unfortunately, I would add, whereas until 2020, my craziness, obsessiveness about hyper detailed drawings and window views was shared by many people, but not so many. After the pandemic, especially in Italy and other places where the lockdown was really lockdown, we all realized that while I was doing these drawings, I was here. And I felt that there were so many people looking outside their windows, and they too understood that the window represented not a glass through which seeing the world, but also a mirror to look at yourself and your fears, your hopes. So everybody was there looking at somebody else, looking at them in this crossing of a network in which everybody was looking at a world that didn't change apparently, but was not the same. Nobody knew exactly why, meaning physically there. Everything is the same, but it's totally empty. You project desires coming from the past and the future. Everybody had that moment of understanding, basically, about how instead, on a daily basis, people who have put their lives at risk or are maybe alive and they're looking at outside of a window. This is how they do it every day in their lives.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's an act of courage. Beautifully said. Well, yeah, I mean, Windows and Elsewhere is such a beautiful, it feels like a keepsake, something that I would want to give my children, or, you know, something that will always be around, and, you know, in 100 years from now, I'll still have it, and perhaps my grandchildren will have it. So if you're interested in checking it out more, check out Art for Human Rights, our website, and have a closer look at what it's all about. Matteo, I want to discuss some of your more recent projects and what you're currently up to right now, especially around the sort of your laboratory of literary architecture, which I find fascinating. Do you want to just share some thoughts around what you're doing there, what it means, and why it matters?
Why it matters, we leave it aside, because who knows? But I don't know. It's, again, perhaps there is a connection with trying to see how do we really see when we look at what we think that is there. And this has to do with architecture and stories. Stories are seemingly out there for everybody to read because they're the same words and same chapters, same paragraphs, and same is architecture. But one day in 2010, I just moved recently to Turin. I found myself at a creative writing school, having never really written anything particular, but being asked to hold a workshop or a short course. And I just blurted out, you keep talking about the architecture of a novel. I mean, you keep talking the structure of stories, using words that you remind me of architecture. I was an architect, as you may remember, once, and maybe I kept my viewing and building things in mind. And instead of talking to me about it, using words to explain things that are done with words, why don't you show me? Why don't you just build a paper cardboard model and show me why this story doesn't fall, or the foundation of this story? Why? So cool. What's its architecture? And this was just a curiosity, a question pushed out of me by, really, I want to know what you're talking about by not hearing you talk. And the result was mind-blowing. I had no idea what I was tapping into. There were 28 people who had never studied architecture or drawing or design, and all of them had incredibly sophisticated ideas about design and composition, and that I didn't know where they were coming from. And I was, again, mind-blown, flabbergasted, or any of these words, and I could not figure out why. I had studied architecture. I'd never come up with ideas like those while studying architecture. I never heard architects talking about what spaces say, not what we say about spaces, but what do they say in terms
Yes.
of spatial arrangement and spatial narrative, that I understood in time, because this was 13 years ago, that the act of reading, like the act of seeing, is an incredibly creative act. We all do it. We do it all the time. And people who read stories, read books, become people who are able to navigate these spaces, these structures that are designed around us. And they're not the obvious imagination of where the story happens, the house where the protagonist lives. And these are things that we do all the time because they're necessary, but and they come from our experience. How does the story work? How does the waiting for the most incredible an unexpected moment in the plot occurs? How long do you have to wait? How does it crash on you? How much clarity is in the writing, or how much darkness is in the writing? How do the sequencing happens? And the same story that I've been doing, for example, for 12 years, story by Amy Hempel, has had maybe 90 or 100 reiterations or projects that are all different from one another. We actively build these spaces in our mind to be able to
Yes.
Inhabit them, basically.
It's it feels like it's a mind-blowing idea, because it feels like an inversion. Often you think of architecture as stories. You kind of, and maybe perhaps that's where it comes from. I'm not an architect, but often you can go into beautiful libraries and sort of see beautiful kind of blueprints and drafts of incredible buildings and architectural wonders, and that becomes literature, right? But now you're sort of completely inverting it, because now we're sort of using the metaphor or the tools of architecture to be able to make new meaning from stories or from books or from poems, maybe. I just want to read out a beautiful passage that's available on your website, lablitarch.com. A story is not like a road to follow. It's more like a house. You go inside and you stay there for a while, wandering back and forth and settling where you like, and discovering how the room and corridors relate to each other, how the world outside is altered by being viewed from these windows. And you, the visitor, the reader, are altered as well by being in this enclosed space, whether it is ample and easy, or full of crooked turns, or sparsely or opulently furnished. You can go back again and again, and the house, the story, always contains more than you saw the last time. It also has a sturdy sense of itself being built out of its own necessity, not just to shelter or beguile you. Wow, it's a beautiful piece of writing, that. But it's just, it's a really revolutionary kind of an idea. Do you feel that looking at stories or literature, in the sense, through the eyes of, or through the tools of architecture, and you being an architect, do you feel that, once again, going back to perspective, this creates different perspectives, this adds meaning to what otherwise would just be words on a page? How does that relationship work in your head?
I don't know. I don't know, in the sense that there are many, maybe one does see. I've done this workshop in many places in the world, not only in Europe, in the US, in Taiwan, in Jerusalem, Dubai, and with people who have nothing to do with architecture, zero comparative literature or writing, or lawyers, or with architects, and it's like going backwards. This is not an experiment that puts two things together. Yes, it inverts something, and what it inverts is that I think when we focus on a product in terms of creativity, we try then to emulate something, because if the product works and I do something similar, maybe by symbiosis I have followed the path that is creative. But here we go backwards. What could be a space that could generate the story? We do a process that is exactly inverse. The amazing quote you read before is by Alice Munro. She's a writer. She's not an architect. And she explains that stories are houses. And the same experience we have with reading the same text, the same words, 5, 10, 20 years later, the physiological experience is totally different. Where we saw maybe darkness when we were teenagers, now we see the clarity, so light, because it puts clarity into something that now we have a different relationship with. When I went to see the Pantheon and I was early 20s, I had never seen it before. I'd studied it, architecture. It looked gigantic, and the emptiness inside pulled my neck upwards. When I went back in my 30s and I'd been in New York for many, many years, it felt different. It was the same place, the same bricks. There is objectively the same thing, as there is objectively the same book. But as Alice Munro says, every time you go back, you see yourself different. You see the world through the windows, she said, of. So imagine for our project, the windows in a story are how, by reading a text, a poem, as you said, but also literature and essays and journalism, you see yourself different, physiologically different. You see the world in a different way. When you're enlightened by something that is happening in the world that you didn't know about, or you hadn't seen it from that perspective, the world looks different. And so the consequence that you were referring to before, it could be gigantic, and I don't know which it could be, because when I see the participants, the workshop that at the beginning cannot go anywhere, after the first day being with high school kids, I've done it with high school kids who finally see architecture not as a discipline. I'm not an architect, so I can't comment on this. Disappears, because once you're inside a story by Amy Hempel or Ernest Hemingway, you are on the other side, and you weigh the weight of the characters, of their dialogue, or something that is about to happen, how it weighs on you. You don't do it with words. Thoughts have shapes before they have content. We are obsessed with content and words that we attach to ideas that we have. There are moments in our lives when we have thoughts that are just forms, instincts, and we rush to putting words attached to them all around.
The brain gets in the way.
Gets in the way, and the language gets in the way. The brain, I think, is much freer than we pretend it to be. So the laboratory acts at a moment by inverting everything, and you say you have how does the decision in Hills Like White Elephant of doing the surgery weighs on the dialogue? How much does it weigh? You can actually build that way according to your experience. If you're 16 or 35 and you're a man or a woman, or you live in the Western world or in Asia, that way I think is different, or you're depicted in a different way. And I think it's like a gigantic, like a volcano. There is a gigantic amount of creativity pressed underneath us that we don't have access to, because we are just readers. The creators are the ones who write stories or build architecture. But without us going through the space of a building and recreating in our mind or reading a book, there isn't a product of creativity. We create it.
Yeah, it's such a great heuristic in a way, a kind of retraining the brain on how to experience something. And in this case, it's a story. And when you kind of experience it in a different way, then you kind of find new things. Just like that beautiful piece said, it's like when I hear covers of songs by the Beatles. It makes you really appreciate the originals again, because it's just so good at its core. But you find another perspective, you find another way in, and it's like, oh, great! Those lads from Liverpool really knew what they were doing. But it's really profound. I love the idea. It kind of liberates the brain to be able to make new meanings. Matteo, just before we go, I want to be able to kind of just sort of draw some attention to currently what you're up to, what you're doing. Where can people kind of read up a little bit more about what you're up to at the moment, follow your progress? Maybe there's some events coming up.
Well, I'm mostly in my small studio closet. No, I finally have begun to, thanks to the book that was published now here in Italy, The Great Museum of Imagination, which is a building book with floor plans that talks about literary architecture, I began again to hold, after the pandemic as well, I began to hold more sessions of this workshop in various places, and which is to me is the most enriching experience, because I when you see these things happening to other people, you are happy because you see stuff that you did not expect because they didn't expect it. And at the same time, I began in February to hold a weekly a series with La Stampa, the national newspaper you mentioned earlier, in which I offer basically a drawing, a sketch of a piece of architecture, and in a kind of a strange sequence, that drawing, that design, that architecture is read as if it were a story. So not too many explanations, and at the end it says what's inspired by, and it's inspired by often a novel or a short story that I've read, a piece of literature, and then one that comes from the laboratory of literary architecture, so other readings or interpretations of maybe the same story, because there are billion different interpretations. Then one is a real piece of architecture, an existing piece of architecture that is read as if it came from a story, because architecture tells stories. And then there is one in this strange series that all of a sudden came up, which is about personal or autobiographical or very, very, the perspective we were talking about before, personal experiences. One, for example, is a building inspired, read as if it were a story, but inspired by the relationship I had with my grandmother, or the sense, that strange sense of the summer that is about to end, or the sunsets over in fresh evenings, or my relationship with my memories, or how I would love to let go of things and I can't. And those are buildings that then, if you see the inspiration inspired by relationship with an important person in your life, you see mine, but that may prompt you, Alex, to imagine your own building of your relationship with somebody who was very important in your life. If it had that shape, instead of the curves, maybe is more angled or higher or more pressing. And it's a way to try to instill in a very compact fashion more or less the ideas behind the laboratory, and that's what's happening also now, and it's somewhat exciting because it's unusual. Maybe there could be a way to look into ourselves, and instead of talking, you build the most important elements of your inner self in terms of who you are, who you think you are, what your relationships with other things or peoples or ideas are, and you build them. And you see them, and you move them apart and say, oh my God, this could be farther than it actually is. Or I couldn't be underneath this because I could move it and design it. And maybe you go through things in your life in a different way, because everything is a story. The narrative, the sense of narrative impregnates basically every aspect of our life. And architecture has the perfect way to go into that, because we do it on a daily basis since we are born until today, and we just don't realize it, what it feels like to open a window as a symbolic act, or go down or up the stairs, or go through a threshold, as we were saying perhaps earlier. So this is more or less.
Wow, beautifully said. You've certainly opened a window, or a couple of windows in my mind during our conversation today. I've just loved hearing about your stories and how your brain works and how you see the world, and I definitely hope that you can hop onto another show with us in the near future. I suspect that you and I could probably talk for hours and hours. Just make sure that there's enough coffee coming, and but it's been wonderful to have you, and it's been wonderful to explore your art.
You were great, and it is an honor to thank you for the time you have given me, and the care, and it felt really like all these things that happened with the Art for Human Rights, and it was very, very nice. You were great, and thank you for inviting me.
Thanks, my friend. Anytime. Yeah. See you soon again. Thanks. Cheers.